So, Mike Rowe, you're joining us now at Faithwire CBN. Thank you for coming on. I want to ask, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. They got me back here in this very, very fancy closet. So
Right?
you got my undivided attention. Things are great.
So you couldn't ask for more. That you got it. We've got you hostage right now, and for just a few minutes. So you have a brand new TBN show coming this spring, The Story Behind the Story, and it's a spinoff of the podcast that's been popular that you've had for a while, The Way I Heard It. So can you tell us a little bit about how the show opportunity came about?
Well, it's very strange. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, but I had been writing these short 5-minute mysteries based on the old Paul Harvey model called The Rest of the Story. And that was what the podcast was. And I would do one a week, and I'd been doing it for a few years. And Matt Crouch over at TBN saw or listened to these stories and really said, I would prefer to watch them. And I said, what are you talking about? It's a podcast. He said, no, but I think we could bring them to life with recreations. And I said, no, I don't. I just don't think that's going to work, because each story has a surprise, and you don't want to give away the surprise. Anyway, he went away on his own and created 3 of these. Right? He took my stories and he brought them to life, and then he showed them to me, and he was right. They looked great, and I said, what we ought to do is sit down and talk about these stories for a show on TBN. And he said, well, what would we call it? And I said, call it The Story Behind the Story. So we've done like 40 of them, and they're going to premiere on May 7th. And it is unlike any other show on TV.
Wow. Look, so you are no stranger, of course, to storytelling. That's what you've done with Dirty Jobs over the years. That's what you do with the podcast, what you're going to be doing with the show. But I want to ask, how did the initial idea, even for the podcast, come about? Why was that something you wanted to do?
Well, like you say, telling stories is sort of the goal, whether it's on Dirty Jobs or somebody's got to do it or returning the favor or just basic writing. And the podcast space was new, where it felt new anyway. And I just thought, well, I don't know much about that world, but I'm on planes a lot. And writing on planes is something I've always done. So I just started writing these short mysteries on these flights, recording them and putting them out there. That's really all it was. It was a way to pass the time on flights and in diners. I lived on the road for about 20 years, and I just wrote in the cracks. And those were the stories that I wrote, and those were the stories that Matt heard. And now the next thing you know, here we are.
I think so much of what you do in storytelling, whether it's been on TV and writing, in podcast form, I think the reason it resonates with so many people is because it's undergirded by a value system or a principle system. And I want to ask maybe about your personal story. Where did that desire, that motivation come from in your own life?
Well, I grew up on a little farm in rural Maryland outside of Baltimore. And my parents were school teachers, and my neighbor happened to be my grandparents. And there was really nobody else around. And my grandfather was a huge influence on me. He could build a house without a blueprint. My granddad could. He only went to the 7th grade, but he was an inspiration to me. Went on to become a skilled tradesman, plumber, steam fitter, pipe fitter, electrical contractor, all of that. And Dirty Jobs, which most people know me from, was a tribute to him. And everything that followed after that, including the foundation that I run today, was a tribute to him. So finding ways to tell stories of people like my pop really was the impetus for so much of what I've wound up doing. And nobody's more surprised than me to see how that has caught hold. But Dirty Jobs has been on the air for 20 years,
Yeah.
and now with the pandemic and the lockdowns and essential workers being in the headlines for so long, people have a renewed interest, I think, in hearing stories that do have something essential to them, whether it's an underlying integrity or some kind of rumination on a theme that still matters. Delayed gratification, perseverance, a decent attitude. I I'm attracted to stories about people who are on a mission, mad scientists who want to make a better mousetrap, people that want to change the world. Um, why are those people out there? What makes them tick? That's mostly what I write about. And I think that's what appealed to Matt and to TBN.
Yeah, and when I think about you're talking about delayed gratification and doing something for the sake of doing it right and doing it well, these seem to be principles that are, I don't want to say that younger people don't have them because I think it's unfair to say that they don't have them. But I think that we've culturally, we've lost the premium that we once placed on them. Why do you think that is? And how do you, I know Dirty Jobs help to bring some of that back and help to teach people the value of work. But how do you think, writ large, we can restore some of that in our American culture?
Well, it's a complicated question, and I don't think there's one specific answer or playbook. But part of whatever the answer is has to be storytelling. We have to do a better job of magnifying people who have prospered or found a measure of happiness by doing the very things that we want to celebrate. Learning a skill, for instance, that's in demand. Um, People who live their lives by some sort of a code. I think that's important. Telling their stories is important. The problem
Hmm.
is, you know, nobody wants a sermon and nobody wants a lecture and nobody wants to be scolded. And I certainly don't want to do any of those things either. So it's a tricky balance. Dirty Jobs, first and foremost, was an entertainment program. If it wasn't entertaining, nobody would watch, and therefore nobody would care about those themes that are just under it. Same
Yeah.
is true of this show. So the story behind the story is fun because you get to watch a story that I wrote years ago brought to life in a really surprising way. And then you get a really lively conversation about why Matt thinks I wrote it versus why I think I wrote it. And what comes out of that conversation really goes to the heart of your question because it allows us to ruminate on some of these qualities that I know every parent would love to see in their kid and every employee would love to find in their employees. So yeah, it's a chance to check a lot of different boxes. But like
Hmm.
Dirty Jobs, it starts with a desire to pull you in and tell you something you didn't know about somebody you do.
I want to ask with the series starting in May. I want to ask if there's been any stories really that resonated with you. I'm sure they all do, but has there been one that resonated with you in a surprising way and something that kind of took you by surprise? You weren't expecting it to hit you the way that it did.
So many, you know, so many because when you when you start with a figure that you're already familiar with and then deliberately look for something about that person that you didn't know, you're going to be surprised. Now, it's a tough question to answer without spoiling the
Right.
reveal, right? So I can't really do it simply, but I can tell you that, all right, for instance, I wrote a story years ago about a traveler who stopped at an inn and had a conversation with the innkeeper. The innkeeper was a guy named John Spurrier, and the traveler is a mystery. And the conversation that I imagine these two had occurred before the signing or the swearing in of the first president of the United States. And we learn through my story that this traveler is George Washington. And the point of my story, which is largely made up, is to only use direct quotes attributed to George Washington historically. So the tale is about a fictitious conversation between John Spurrier and George Washington. One of many actual conversations that he would have had, because that's the inn where he always stayed in his travels. But this story is about how the phrase, "so help me God," became a part of the oath of office. And it was George Washington who added those words, and he did it spontaneously. It wasn't a part of the actual story. So, or the actual oath. Anyway, that's a convoluted way of saying I wrote that story. It's called At the Crossroads. It's episode 124. I wrote it a few years ago. Just last week on my podcast, I sit down with a guy named Dr. Peter Lilbart, who is brilliant and wrote a 1,300-page book on Washington. So he talks to me about how that story is credible, what I got right, what I got wrong, and his take on it as an expert. That's basically what this show is, except I'm not bringing in historians. I'm sitting down with the son of a preacher man to talk about the morality plays that are informing all the stories I write. That was kind of convoluted, but does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it highlights for our listeners and for our viewers the importance of storytelling and why that's so critical in this process. Because if you don't have a story, like you said, you're not going to get people to latch on. They need some reason to feel like it matters. And I want to transition just in our last few minutes to talk about your foundation. You mentioned it earlier, the MicroWorks Foundation. You've really been one to put your money where your mouth is and have invested in people, given them scholarships to help them pursue a trade, which can be really profitable. And I think so often people just don't realize it. So why did you decide to start the foundation? I know you said you did it as a dedication to your grandfather, but why have you decided to continue to do that?
Well, I did well by dirty jobs. And one of the things that I noticed in 2008, when the country went into a recession, was that there was a giant skills gap in our country. And most of the industries that I was working with were struggling to recruit workers, people who were willing to learn a skill that was in demand. And so I started a kind of a PR campaign to call attention to a couple million jobs, good jobs, that for whatever reason people weren't excited about. And that led to the scholarship program that I run today. In fact, we just will be giving away $1 million this month in work ethic scholarships. So if you know somebody who wants to explore welding or plumbing or pipe fitting or electric, any of that, you can go to my foundation and you can apply for a work ethic scholarship. I do it because there's so much pressure on kids today to get a 4-year degree. And a 4-year degree is not a bad thing, but it's a very, very expensive thing. And we have over 11 million open positions in our economy right now. And so many of those positions don't require a 4-year degree. So I wanted to do something to make a case for those jobs and those people who were willing to work in that way. And I've just kept doing it because I've seen it work. We've helped over 1,400 people so far. It's making a difference. And why not? As legacies go, most TV shows don't have one. Dirty Jobs does, and I'm happy to keep it going.
Yeah. My last question for you is you mentioned the economy, and I think there's so many more things that factor in than just the numbers, the financial aspect of the economy and the culture. I think some of it, a great deal of it, is a lack of hope. And I know that your show at TBN, I know the podcast, the work that you do infuses some hope in a largely hopeless culture right now. I want to ask, what's your prognosis? What do you see as the future of the economy and our culture as we move forward?
Well, that's a that's a macro question,
Yeah.
right? To a micro guy. MicroWorks really exists because honestly, I don't have a macro answer. I don't have a crystal ball, and it's hard for me to say with any level of certainty what's going to happen to the economy more broadly. I do believe that you can't separate blue collar from white collar anymore. I do think that a workforce that's out of balance is really a threat to our national security. And right now, our workforce is out of balance. So I'm doing what I can to try and rebalance that. But more importantly, I'm not looking at the economy overall. I'm looking specifically at individuals who are willing to sign a sweat pledge, who are willing to make a video, willing to provide me with references, willing to write an essay, willing to make a persuasive case for themselves. And when people do that, I give them money. And that money is spent on training them to do a very specific job. So, not to dodge your question, but the only way I can answer it
Oh,
honestly is to tell you that it's it's much smaller than the whole economy.
yeah.
It's much more personal, and so that's how I run my foundation. It's one man at a time, one woman at a time. Who are you? What do you want to do? Tell me why. And if we check all the boxes, then we write a check. And the next
Hmm.
thing you know, look, the stories are amazing. We've been doing it now for 14 years. And early on, I didn't have any evidence beyond the anecdotal. I could tell you what I saw and I could tell you what I thought. Now I can circle back to people who we assisted 4 or 5 years ago. And when you meet those people today, the welder who's making $140,000 has no debt, having a second kid. Those stories are great. They're empowering. And so that's really my job today. It's not just to raise money and run a scholarship program. It's to tell the stories of the people who prospered as a result. And
Yeah.
that's, to the extent that I'm hopeful about the future, I'm hopeful for the individuals who are still willing to work in a way that I know bears fruit.
Yeah. Look, I don't think you dodged the question at all. I think as much as it sounds like a cliche Hallmark card, maybe the way you change culture is one person at a time.
Right.
It's impacting families and individuals. You can't just. I think often I want to walk into my bedroom and say, "Oh my goodness, it's a complete, it's a complete mess." But the way you organize it and clean it up is one corner at a time, and then
Sure.
it's fixed.
That's it.
So I don't think you dodged the question at all, and I appreciate, Mike, you taking a few minutes to talk with us about what you're doing, about your new show at TBN, which, if I'm right, it premieres on May 7th, correct?
May 7th, that's a Saturday evening at 9 p.m. And again, not to overstate it, but it's unlike any other TV show I've ever seen. I think people are going to like it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you.